afternoon, Soph.
Afternoon. Rach, it is indeed afternoon when we are talking. It is public holiday in New South Wales, so it is late afternoon here, and I am now 3 hours ahead of you.
Yes, thanks to daylight saving. So I just want to welcome anyone who's listening to us for the first time. This is Dear Rach and Soph. And of course, say thank you to anyone who's coming back to listen to us again. We really appreciate it. Dear Rach and Soph is a conversation between two writing friends about all sorts of things in the industry. And I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today.
It's one of your favourite subjects.
One of my favourite subjects, yes. We've got a couple of questions, also episodes and stuff coming up. So if you've got any questions for us, please remember to send them along. And if you love our podcast, can you please consider taking a minute to rate us on wherever you listen to your podcast and listen and write a review if you're really feeling generous, because that really helps us find other listeners. So
always forget about that part. And I follow listen to a podcast by a woman called Coyne.
Sorry, everyone, I swallowed air.
You inhaled air, Rach. We don't like it.
Yeah, no. Anyway, sorry, what were you saying?
I was going to say, I follow a woman called Coco Moco on Substack, and she also has a podcast. I found her on TikTok, and she's like this marketing trend forecaster. And she was on her podcast was saying the whole, can you like leave us a review, rate and review? And I was thinking, oh, that's right, that's a thing.
I know. I was listening to a podcast this morning. I always listen to podcasts on my walk, and so it was a pertinent reminder again for me this morning, because I came to the end of a podcast, and that podcast is a writing one too. What's it called? I think First Draft or something like that, which I really enjoy listening to. I'll have to check. Anyway, and the podcaster said, please leave us a review. It really helps. So I was like, I must remember to do that. So tick that off. I'm ticking jobs off my list today. I've been writing this morning. It's a public holiday there, but you've been writing too, I hear?
I have, yeah. I'm coming hard and fast on a deadline. And at the time we're speaking, I'm at the end of this week going to the Sunshine Coast Hinterland Writers Festival to take like a couple of dozen pictures in person. And
are you taking non-fiction pictures, or are you taking across the board?
Across the board, because I look at our submissions and look at them on behalf of fiction and children's publishers, and so I often take pictures for all. I'm teaching a pitch workshop on the Saturday morning, and then I'm doing In Conversation with Nardi Simpson on the Sunday morning. So I'm trying to finish the manuscript, and I'll be in the office for the rest of the week. I've got a couple of events this week at night, and also trying to.
I know time sort of goes. I know you believe that there'll always be enough time, and I'm really trying to tell myself that now, because so your book's due in the end of October.
No, the 15th of October.
That's right, middle of October. So by the time we've put this session out, because we're banking a few, you will hopefully have finished and submitted. My book is due the end of January. Although any earlier would be great since it's coming out.
And please remind people which book this is.
This is a new women's fiction novel called The Lucky Sisters. We did some research on the podcast actually about this a couple of episodes ago. So if you've been listening, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I've only got 5,000 words as of today. And I write quite long novels, usually about 120 to 140,000 words. So, I have to keep up quite a pace every week to manage to finish that by that time, while also I've decided I'm having the week around Christmas off, And then, I know. And then like you, I'm going away this weekend. There's events coming up for my book Outback Reunion. There's just other things, like life just happens. So it eats into that time. But so I'm trying to tell myself there is time. It will get done. The problem is I doubt, as I know that I can have the ability to write that many words in that time if I know what's going on.
Do you think it's also because partly I'm looking at the deadline looming and how much I have left to write, but I've made a decision to not panic.
Yeah,
because panic is useless, really. And
what happens in the night before you haven't finished? Will you panic then?
I won't let that happen. I won't let it get to the stage where I'm that close, because I will sacrifice sleep in order to get it done. But also I realized this happens every novel. I'm like, oh my God, I don't have much time left and I have a lot left to write. But then I remember that I spent a ton of time planning.
Yeah.
So what I'm actually doing.
You're not taking that time into account when you're. Yeah.
Not taking that time into account. So it feels like I've kind of back-ended it really badly. As in I'm just leaving a bit of the writing till the end, but it's actually what I've done is set up set up the situation whereby I can flow towards the end, because essentially, particularly for this novel, as I've said before, I planned it further ahead than I usually plan. I'm actually planning right at the end. So really what I'm doing is just try to follow the river, go with the flow of the river and jump into the current and just go. And I will sacrifice sleep as needed, knowing it's temporary, and to get it done. And the night before, I may not have it done, but that's get up really early the next morning and finish. And it is the first draft, and I will.
You see, by then I'd be panicking and have told everyone at least 2 weeks before that. But I just want to ask you a quick question, and it's leading into what we're going to discuss today, which is craft books, because you said you planned more than usual. And the interesting thing is, well, I'm very much at the beginning of the novel, but I have planned a little bit more than I usually do as well. Now, I have a feeling my plan might not be as detailed as your plan. Tell us what the plan kind of looks like, or how long.
It's not that detailed, like the planning documents are pretty detailed, and I was quite pleased with myself, I have to say, because I went back and looked at my major plot points document, which is separate to my character profiles. It's separate to the grid, which is my working document for storyline. It's really where I think about, once I've done my character planning, I'll then do this major plot points document where I think about the arc of the character story, and I've got like 5 stages in it, and then I put quite a bit of detail into that. And previous novels, I've often varied quite a bit from that, but then I went back and had a look at the one for this manuscript, and it's pretty much exactly as I'm writing it. So I thought, okay, that means the planning for this one really embedded.
Yeah.
And when I plotted it through to the end, that was in the back of my mind, because I didn't consciously have all of that in my mind. I wasn't going back to that document to refer to as I was plotting. But the detail work is actually just that color-coded Microsoft Word table that has a couple of sentences for each chapter.
So I don't have chapter that, like, I could not be that detailed, I think, but I have done more, like, for the first time ever, and this is because I have a couple of significant things that I knew have to happen and I wasn't sure when, and one of them, I'm trying not to give away, but so I had to work that out, and as I was working at that, and I'd just done. So we're going to talk about craft books, and one of my favourite craft books, which I've never actually read the whole way through, is Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Do you know Save the Cat?
Only from you.
Yeah, so Save the Cat started as just a Save the Cat book, which I've got too, because over here, hey, let's have a little look. We're going to talk about craft books today, because I'm obsessed with writing craft books. So yeah, when I'm talking about craft, this is a writing podcast, so I'm not talking about like knitting and embroidery and decoupage or all those, is that what I mean? Anyway, all that kind of stuff. Talking about writing craft and how to write a good book the best you can. One of the books I've got here is Save the Cat, which is the original kind of book that started to save the cat.
I tried to find it as an ebook. I don't think that one on its own is available, at least not in Apple Books, which is where I looked.
That's really interesting. Well, so Save the Cat, the guy was going to come, Blake Snyder was going to come to Romance Writers Conference years ago, and then sadly passed away. So he didn't. But Save the Cat is a screenwriting book, and it's got examples from, numerous movies that we all have, most of us have seen, or at least, know something about. I think like Groundhog Day. I'm just trying to look at some.
And it is, I'm just looking, it's available as an audio book, Save the Cat, on Apple Books. We're trying to be helpful here, Rach, and provide some information.
Anyway, so basically it goes through the beats that happen in every screenplay, to sort of sort the mediocre screenplays, or the ones that don't get sold and made, from the ones that do. And he sort of looks at why. And I mean, you mentioned arcs and structure before, and I think he does talk about, I don't know if it's a 3-act structure or what, but basically that was the beginning. And then
it's available as a Kindle. I've just had it on Kindle, but not on Apple Books, intriguingly, by the look.
And then Jessica Brody, who used Blake Snyder's book in one of her own novels, she was contracted, I think, or she wrote this book. It's a much more detailed book because it's for novelists rather than screenwriters, and we have to write a lot more, actual words. And so she basically breaks up the Save the Cat method into different types of books.
Oh,
So there's like buddy love. That's one I can remember. I'm trying to think what the others are. I'm trying to open it up. And she talks about plotters and pantsers and like why done it, rites of passage books, dude with a problem book, full triumphant book. There's some of the examples. Monster in the house book. So basically she says that most of the books you're trying to write will fit into these. I've noticed that most of my books, whether they're romance or women's fiction, fit into the buddy love plot.
Okay.
Which is kind of as this is underlining here, or sort of subline that says the transformative power of love or friendship. So, I think women's romance is often about, well, it's usually about the transformative power of love, and women's fiction is often about the transformative power of the other relationships in our lives, right?
Yeah, which is what mine novels are.
Exactly. So this time round, because I had a vague idea, like we start with the premise and or characters. And my premise for this book was two adopted sisters who received life-changing news just before their 50th birthday, and the very different ways they both react to it. I've got that written in my on my screen down there, so I know. And so, but that's like all I knew. I didn't know who they were. I just knew that I wanted them to be very, very different. Because another thing I found when I was first coming up with this idea is a quote. I'm just going to try and find it. It said something like, where are we? It says, of two sisters, one is always the watcher and one the dancer. And I thought, well, that's really good character sort of summary. It tells you immediately what kind of person they're going to be. So that's kind of all I had. But I also knew, as I said, some major scene there's, and I was panicking about the time I had left. So usually I'm not much of a planner. I do sometimes try and use things like the Save the Cat beats, but this time I have, and I listened. What I did, as well as reading the writing craft book, which I've had for years, I actually did a masterclass over 2 weekends with Jessica Brody that I paid for online via Zoom. I didn't listen to it in person, but I really just solidified the types of things that need to happen in the book. And so I already had ideas about certain scenes, but I'm trying to work out where they fit best. And so I have written a plan as well, which I do think so gives me a little bit of a safety net. I do feel like that's what I feel. But it's very early days. And so I'm not, I'm not a complete convert to plotting over pantsing. But, I think, as I've said probably before on this, there's, for anyone to be a professional writer and to continually put out books, I don't think you can be completely a plotter or a pantsy. You've got to find sort of your way in between, because of even if you've got a plan, things happen and change along the way, and you've got to be open to that, and the characters, take on a life of their own, and then they alter what the plan is. But I'm hoping that the plan means that I have a better chance of meeting my deadline. So that's one of the books in my huge collection of writing craft books, and I do think it's a really good one if you want to really analyze the structure in books. And maybe sometimes it's a good idea to do it after you've written a first draft. I kind of often, or my theory is that I should do some craft research between books, or craft revision between books, but then not really worry about it when I'm actually writing. And I actually heard someone else say that the other day. I can't remember who. I think it was probably on a podcast, or I read it on Substack, that between each novel they usually read a new craft book, or they do a course or something, and I think a lot of the stuff you learn in craft books, depending on what stage you are in your writing career, a lot of the stuff you kind of already know on some level, but it's good to be reminded of it kind of constantly.
For anyone who's listening, who's thinking, why does Rachel need to read craft books? She's had so many best-selling books. She's so experienced. Is it just that it's good to be reminded?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously I've been so why do I have all these books? There's two reasons. So one is it's a bit like diets in the magazines and stuff. It's like, oh, brand new way to lose 10 kilos, and you're like, oh, sucked in, grab the book and then buy it, and then you read it and it's like, eat less, exercise more. there's really.
And it's Adina Monsoon once said to her daughter Saffron, and absolutely fabulous. Oh, if it were that easy, Safi, everyone would do it.
Exactly. And I guess if it was that easy about writing books, well, probably everyone wouldn't do it because not everyone has that. I think for writers and particularly writers, but even sometimes readers, it's hard to imagine that, not everyone wants to write a book or read books. But yeah, so I always think there's got to be a better way than I'm doing it, especially because for many, many years, I do have quite a messy process that, it's pretty airy-fairy. I start with a vague idea. I trust the magic and I just kind of go and let the characters, talk to myself. So talk to me and tell me what's going on. And because I am on tight deadlines, and I always think, it would be better if I could do this in a more succinct way, and so that's why I get all these billions of books. I'll just before I tell you some of the ones that I've actually, like, most of these I'll have to say I haven't even read. So I buy them because of that reason, because I think, maybe I will read them and maybe it'll be the book that, changes my career and changes me from being, a good seller in Australia and, being able to make a living, to someone who is like Leanne Moriarty, Nora Roberts type of success. I think maybe that's what's holding me back. Maybe it's a craft thing and I need to just make my books that little bit better. So I always looking out for ways to do that. So some of the ones I've got here are like, but there's also genre type things. So, there's like Forensics with Val McDermid. Never read it. Sounds interesting.
But you will read it if you want to write a forensic detective.
Yeah, I will. And there's How to Write a Cozy Mystery, because I'm quite keen on that. Here's another one, How to Write a Mystery by Lee Child. So we're getting. Okay. Then I've got some really fun ones here. There's a book.
But those three suggest to me that you do perhaps have mystery writing on your mind.
I would love to write a mystery one day. And then I've got, this is a great one too. It's another mystery one. If I tell you, I'll have to kill you. And it's a collection of Australian crime writers talking about various things. And I think the other reason I like reading books, craft books, is that I love hearing about other people's writing processes. Not necessarily that I'm going to try and emulate their exact process, but I just find it fascinating how people do it. There's another one I've got, Janet Ivanovic, who wrote lots of books, but is most famous for her Stephanie Plum series, How I Write. I have read most of that one. It's a very easy to read kind of,
as her Stephanie Plum books are.
Yes, easy. Exactly. So, and then I've got a lot of ones that are about structure, or like this Robert McGee's Story, which is a big, a book that many writers and screenwriters will, have on there. He's
considered to be a guru. Yeah.
Yes. Have I read any of it? Let's see. There's a few highlighted bits in the first 20 pages. I got this book as a prize, so that one I'm not going to be, annoyed at myself for buying and not reading. Another interesting one I've got is Story Grid, Pride and Prejudice. So it takes every single chapter of Pride and Prejudice and tells you, what the inciting incident was, what the progressive complication, what the crisis, what the climax, the resolution. So it's a very deep analysis of.
Do you think when Jane was sitting down with her quill and her ink that she was not?
Probably not.
In its depth, but anyway.
And the interesting thing about this book is that, so Story Grid is there's another book that's just called Story Grid, and there's lots of different ones that are examples. I haven't actually got Story Grid. I just thought, it would be interesting, to look at this. Basically, if I hear about a writing craft book on a podcast, or a writer I know posts about a writing craft book, it takes huge resistance for me not to then immediately go online and order that craft book. I've also got one, Writing the Romantic Comedy, up there, which I haven't read either, but I probably got around the time when I decided I was going to try and write some rom-coms. I've got some really old writing craft books. I can see there's one called Bestseller by Celia Brayford. I don't know if you've heard of her.
I have that. What? I'm sure I've got a book of hers somewhere. Do you find these books by just Googling the term, like how to write a cozy mystery, and that's what comes up?
So those ones, yes. Like The cozy mystery ones, yes, I have found that way. Some of the other writing craft books that are just generally, general craft ones that there've been recommendations or reading kind of thing. I have no idea. I've had this bestseller one for a long time. I reckon I've had this since before I started writing. No, not writing, before I started before it was published. I have no idea where it came from. So this collection has gone and I have not read it. Maybe I should. This is the problem talking about this as well. So this collection has been going a long time, and now I kind of just think, well, it doesn't really matter if I buy them. I'm just keep adding to. It's like, some people collect shoes, some people collect spoons. I collect writing craft books. But there's a few that people have really recommended, and some classic ones there, like Writing Screenplays That Sell by Michael Haig. So some of them, I find a lot of the writing craft books are actually screenwriting books. And that's why I particularly was excited about Save the Cat Writes a Novel, because, although there's similar elements, you've got to go through certain plot points, you've got to take readers on a roller coaster, and as we've said earlier, you've got to have, character growth and all that kind of stuff. The actual format of a screenplay is very different to a novel. Yeah. So
speaking of, one of the books I have here is a screenwriting related book. It's One Walks Into the Woods. Snap. I loved it just because it's actually about structure more than anything. And it's about archetypes. So there's quite a lot of references to ancient stories, and
I love talking about archetypes. I think I went up to page 11.
I do encourage you to read further, only because I found it so interesting. I think it's just, if you're interested in stories at all, and it's a highly readable book.
Yeah.
So that's.
I would recommend actually almost all of these books. I haven't stopped because I've thought, hang on, that's
because you've got stuff to do, right? You've got books to write.
It's because I've got stuff to do. So I always think, I'll read this book and that, in between, then life just gets in the way, and then I turn to fiction then as I'm writing. So, and as I said, sometimes I think when you're actually writing a first draft, I don't know if it's particularly useful to be immersed in a craft book about how to, because then you might be listening more to that, doubting what you're writing, and as you just said before, the book you're handing in is a first draft. You don't want to be, that's when you want to be getting the sort of the magic and the gold down, and not letting that internal critic think too much. And I think the other thing is, if we have been readers for a long time or watchers of movies and stuff to an extent, we know structure. It's like, inbuilt in us. Yeah. So you've got to, trust that to an extent. So I'll tell you my favorite writing craft books, though, the ones that I have actually read more of. But first, you've got less, and tell me why.
Well, I think it's just because I've been working in publishing for a while, actually. Yeah. So I think it's because
you already know everything, right, Soph?
Well, look, I'd love to think so. But I think it's actually just that applying principles of story and structure and all sorts of things in being an editor. That I haven't actually read the craft books. It's not through lack of interest. It's just, I think, just been doing stuff.
You could write a craft book, probably.
Oh God, no! There are, as we've seen from your shelves, there are several out there, and several very, very good ones. I don't think I have anything at all to contribute to the body of work on craft.
Yeah, I kind of simile. It's not even a word. This is why I shouldn't write a craft book, because I can't even tell you real words. I like that word though, simile. Do you reckon that's a good word?
Well, there is simile, S-I-M-I-L-E. I like so.
Except I don't know why. Was I saying simile or semi?
Similarly, you were saying.
Maybe that was what I was saying. I have similar thoughts to you in that, particularly like a lot of these people have really, say Save the Cat Writes a Novel, for instance. Jessica Brody has really spent time analysing other stories in each genre. So she gives examples. She's also talks about movies. It's almost like a PhD that she's done in order to, and some of the greatest structural sort of teachers, like Robert McGee and Michael Haig, as far as I know, they haven't actually written many novels or screenplays themselves. They've, I think Michael Haig has written some, but you know what I mean? Often they've just really, really studied what works. in, other stuff.
Also, what you were saying about, we all know it if we've watched a lot or read a lot. And I think part of John Yorke's argument is that structure is inherent to human storytelling.
Yes.
But we know it. We do know it because if we trust our instincts on it, and I've talked before about how I like to sort of feel the rhythm of something, and I'll often think that needs another beat.
Yeah.
In stuff I'm writing as well as stuff that I'm reading. And we all know when we're seeing a movie, for example, where the beats are off and the structure's off. What boggles my mind is that these things get financed, shot, and released.
Yeah.
I think.
And I wonder if that is because like the type of movies they are. So like I think it's really and you may have other examples, but I think it's really like often like really arty kind of like films and stuff. They get away with more than like if it's a blockbuster that's going to have to, bring in bank at the cinema.
But I think Wonder Woman 2 is an example of a movie where
okay.
Wonder Woman, the original, as in the original modern day one, was structurally fantastic. Wonder Woman 2, I remember thinking, what happened here? I could only think that somehow like studio executives got their fingers into the storytelling because the beats were just way off. It didn't.
Or did they not have enough time or effort because they're like, well, we've already got it. We're already onto a sure thing kind of thing. Like people like take for granted things and just say, I don't know. But yeah,
I don't know. But
I think because often, you'll hear, oh, literary fiction doesn't necessarily have the same beats or whatever. But then I think the best literary fiction that I've read, and I will say I don't read a whole load of literary fiction, and it's the literary fiction that crosses over, so that people who read commercial fiction and people who read literary fiction like it, it does have good structure. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's because that would probably be termed high-end commercial.
It's not necessarily obvious. It's obvious maybe as like an action plot or something.
Yeah.
Because it's more internal.
There's a movie I saw recently that was satisfying on many, many levels, but one of them was structure, and that is Hitman, which is starring Glenn Powell and was co-written by him.
I haven't seen that. I'm going to write it down.
Interestingly, it was based on a magazine story from several years before, and in fact had been in development for quite a while. But the movie was just inspired by this story. It's not actually an adaptation of it, but I was watching it, just thought structurally this is incredibly satisfying because I think structure, like so much in art, is about paying a compliment to your audience, which is that I'm going to make sure you're secure here so you have a good time and you're not going to have to worry about what's going on, and you just know that I've got you. Whoever the creator is, it's like, don't worry about it, we've got you. And the signifiers of good structure come pretty early.
Yes.
Unsettle an audience, and it will unsettle a reader if those signifiers are not there, because then they start to subconsciously think, I'm going to have to do some work here and I don't know that I want to.
That's so true. And it's not like we're going to give up on structure for the rest of the book or the rest of the film. But if you set something up really well, you're more likely, if you grip the readers early, they're more likely to stay along for the ride.
Yeah, that's right.
If you, ignore it at your peril, but don't necessarily think too much about it at the same time.
Trust your instincts on the beats. Yeah.
What's that?
Trust your instincts on the beats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think someone said to me last year, because I'm, more of a pantser, they were like, oh, and I was panicking obviously at one stage, thinking I should be planning more because then, then I'll be able to get this out done. It'll, I won't waste as much time, blah, blah, blah. Maybe I won't write, ridiculously long books because I won't write the boring bits or the bits that don't necessarily need to be there. And they're like, I can help you. And they introduced me to Plotter, which I don't know if you've heard of it. I'm worried I'm repeating myself from a previous podcast, but hopefully not, because you've got.
I don't remember you talking about.
And it's PLOTTR, and it's an online resource that has heaps and heaps of different types of structure. So it's got like 3-act structures, it's got 6-act structures, it's got 4-act structure, it's got Save the Cat Writes a Novel, the beats are there, every sort of this hero's journey and all this different stuff. And so you can choose the one you relate most to, and then you can go in and it'll tell you what needs to happen at each day. And I was like, oh, I realize you think that pantsers don't understand story. And that is not true. Some of the best writers, well, who I think are the best writers in the world, are mostly pantsers. And Nora Roberts is a pantser. Leah Moriarty is a pantser. Marianne Keyes is a pantser. Um, I've got a list somewhere, but you know, like you can't tell me they don't understand story structure, right? But it comes organically. So yeah, anyway, going off on a tangent.
Also, no, it's not a tangent because it's germane to what we're talking about. I also just want to pull you up on something you said about I wouldn't be wasting time. I don't think any time is wasted when you're pantsing.
Yeah, I agree.
That's just you are writing your way into the story, and that's your nature. And I'm very fond of saying it's good to know your own nature as a writer or any kind of.
100% agree. If I had 2 years, I wouldn't be worried, and I wouldn't be worried about wasting time. But when I have 3 months, I do worry about wasting time. You know what I mean?
But it's none of it's wasted because even if you end up like I delete so many words. I did it today when I was writing words.
So do I.
Delete. Like I'd write it up, I'm like, oh no, like but that's I'm not a pantser in that I will stop and delete it as I'm going. Whereas a pantser is probably more likely to keep writing through. And
no, I'm very much we'll delete as I go and edit as I go. Unless
I think you are. Then maybe you're not as much of a pantser because
if I'm 100% sure that it's not going anywhere. The problem is with being like, I also believe in trusting the magic, and sometimes if something goes there, like I'm not really sure why, I will leave it. But if I really feel like so I'm not afraid to delete stuff as I'm going. But yeah, like sometimes I have to write to get it right into a scene. And I'm trying to remind myself, as you said, that's not a waste of time necessarily. Like today, for instance, I'm into chapter 2 and sort of 3 because I'm trying to work out what's going to happen kind of in each. And I've been writing like snatches of dialogue and bits of scenes and that, and I haven't quite found the right way to start the book, the scene. So I'm just kind of, writing around it, and most of it I think will be all right, but some of it will have to be gone. But I'm very much I'm trying to be kind to myself as well as have that ticking clock. But so you've got Into the Woods, which I haven't read, but have too. You have mentioned another book quite a few times on the podcast.
Yeah, and which I don't.
It's not exactly a craft book.
Craft book with so
but
much.
I would say not all these are really exactly craft books in that they're not all telling you, how to do something. Some are, as I said, like this is how I do it, kind of, what I mean, or just. Like I've got The Artist's Way, which I'm sure you've heard about, which is.
And I have a copy of that.
Yeah. I've got Bird by Bird by Anne
Gretchen Rubin of Happiness Project and Better Than Before and For Tendencies fame is a fan of Bird by Bird.
Yeah, and I haven't read all of that yet either. And I was listening to her on a podcast yesterday, and I'm like, I really need to get onto that. But I think the thing is, in all podcasts too, but all books, you're not going to relate to everything. Like some of the stuff she said in the podcast, I was like, absolutely not. So, like she said in her thing yesterday when I was listening to, she writes maybe it was Barbara Kinslover. So I've listened to a lot of writing podcasts while walking and cleaning. But one of them said something like, oh, you always write 100 pages, 100 or 200 pages that will be deleted. I was like, I'm not writing out that much and deleting, you know what I mean? Like,
so I love the absolutism of that. You will always write.
Exactly. Oh, and then it was the Anne Lamott that basically said, the first draft is for this, whatever, the second draft is this, and the third, you don't show anyone until the third draft. And I'm like, well,
some of us don't have time.
Yeah, exactly. But so, nothing is, don't take anything as gospel, is what I'm saying. Yeah, but right. Tell us about the other book that you've mentioned.
So the Thorn Necklace I've mentioned before, because
and how you use it.
12 questions framework that is in it, which is what I use for my character profile. So this is Healing Through Writing and the Creative Process. It's by Francesca Leah Block, who writes mainly magical realist, young adult fiction is what she's known for, particularly a book called Weetzie Bat. And it's memoir combined with writing craft suggestions. That 12 questions framework is the thing I use from it the most. I have read it a couple of times just because I love her writing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people could find it useful even if they don't know her work. It's not readily available in print in Australia. It was an import.
Yeah, I've looked it up a couple of times because, as you know, I'm a craft junkie. Let's face it, eventually I will get that book because it will just but yeah, it is kind of harder to find. And I've been like, I think the thing that's made me not buy that book, even though you've mentioned a couple of times, and I desperately want the 12 questions because that sounds like something really useful, is because of the whole, it's more like a memoir as well of creativity or something, so like her life. So I was like, I don't necessarily need that bit. I just want the how to do it book bit.
I'm looking up the sections now as we're going. It's Yeah, so there's the chapter order is find a mentor, find a muse, channel pain into art, banish the critic, chaos into order, develop your style, persevere, face your fears, love, and words into action.
I do love those chapter titles.
In fact, the
You know
12
what I'm going to do? I'll be going on after we finish this. I'll have to go and buy it.
The 12 questions framework, I should say, goes throughout the book. I just use the one in particular for character development, but she's actually got it as part of every single chapter. So like the one on find a mentor has the 12 questions, gifts and flaws in it. And then it's the 12 questions, wants and needs. So you could actually use it if you hadn't written a manuscript before, or you're writing early manuscripts and you want to just find a structure through what she's doing to help you write it. And I think it applies to fiction and nonfiction. She has written both.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Why is it called the Thorn Necklace?
I've forgotten.
Okay.
But she uses a lot of
useful,
imagery like that in her books. Like there's a lot of gods and monsters stuff in her storytelling, a lot of angels, magic is very much part of what she does. So
no, that's interesting. Thank you.
Raised in Los Angeles, and
I still think I should buy it and read it, and that we should discuss it. Since last season we discussed one of my favorite writing. Well, actually, it's not exactly writing. It's a creative living book. It's not really a writing craft book, but because it's by Liz Gilbert. Sorry for everyone. I'm holding it up, but I forget that some people listen to the podcast. It's Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, and I love this book. And I didn't make Sophie read it. She won't do anything that I like unless she wants to do it. But I suggested that she read Big Magic because I thought she would get a lot out of it.
I did.
And she did. And we had a great chat about it. So I really think I should read Thorn Necklace, and we should do that way. Each season we should,
see how you have a bit to do.
I do.
Moment, and we may finish this season of the podcast before you have time
before I do. So it might be next season.
Yeah, you are going to see Liz Gilbert in Sydney, so that's something else we could put on the list to discuss next year.
Definitely a debrief on that. So yeah, if you haven't read Big Magic, I'm not going to go on about that because there's a whole episode in season 1. I really recommend you go back and listen to it if you haven't already. But that's a really good sort of book about living a creative life. One of my other books, which I know you've read, I'm sure, Sophie, is Stephen King's On Writing. I've actually got 2 editions of this. I don't know why. But it's another one that it's not really, it's a memoir of craft. I'm sure many people listening to this have already read it.
It's super readable.
It is.
Yeah.
I love that. I think I've got it on my website actually in the frequently asked questions section. There's a link to rules from Stephen King, and not that, as I said, there are no rules really, and because one of the things he says in here that really is that no first draft should take more than 3 months. So that makes me feel good because I'm like,
well, odds with the Anne Lamott thing of it's
true. Yeah. That's true. But yeah, it's really interesting to sort of take a look into the brain of someone who is such a well-known, well-loved, prolific writer who's been doing it a while. So if you haven't read that, read that. Now, actually, craft books, as I said, Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I do recommend that, and I've dipped in and out of that, but I do think if you do want a safety net of a structure, there's lots of other ones, but this is a really simple way of looking at, at what you need to include. Saying that, there's a book somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. I know what it's called. It's called Romancing the Beat. It's not that one. That's something else. But I can't find it at the moment, but I know it's there. Maybe I'll lend it to someone actually. It's called Romancing the Beat by Gwen. And if you're writing a romance novel, then that's a really good one because it really breaks down the important key sort of points that you need to hit in a romance novel. And it's really thin. So, it won't take you long to read. So even I've read that whole one. And when I am writing a romance novel, I do sort of usually have that on my desk just to kind of remind me. But some of the others that I've had over the years for a long time, and some of them, this one particularly, it's called The Complete Writer's Guide to Heroes and Heroines, 16 Master Archetypes. It's very much of its time in that there's, the male and the female archetypes. But what it is it's 2 sections The first section is all about the hero archetypes. You have stuff like the chief, the bad boy, the best friend, the charmer, the lost soul, the professor, the swashbuckler, and the warrior. And then the second section is about the heroine archetypes, the boss, the seductress, the spirit, spunky kid, the free spirit, the waif, the librarian, the crusader, and the nurturer. And each section tells you like what a person who is, say, a swashbuckler, it tells you, the kind of personality that will include. Then it tells you the qualities of a swashbuckler. It goes into quite detail about that. The flaws. Then the background. There's like the swashbuckler loved excitement. And it goes on to no commitments in the swashbuckler's way. So it really tells you in detail sort of, their backstory. And sometimes it talks about the type of family they may have grew up in, whether they were a loner or someone who was always, the life of the party. And for each archetype, it gives two styles. So here it's got the swashbuckler might be the daredevil, and it breaks that up, or else he might be the explorer. And then it gives you 3 example occupations of, what this character might be or do. So the swashbuckler might be an archaeologist, a bush pirate, and it goes into detail about those, but then there's also some other suggestions. And throughout it gives you examples of that type of person in film and books. Right. Like classic ones like, that we know, like Men in Black, Top Gun. I'm just, these are all swashbuckler ones. So, but what I find useful is that, as I said, when I start, I always do a bit of character planning. So when you do your 12, questions, I will usually start with the character's name, their occupation kind of thing. I often know that because that's often kind of relevant to the story and what type of person they are. And I have a vague kind of idea in my head, and so I go to this book, the Heroes and Heroines 16 Master Archetypes, and I kind of flick through and find the archetype that most calls out to me that I visualize to that person kind of thing. And then I go through and I write notes from that, and just doing the notes kind of helps me brainstorm the character and gives me ideas and little different things. So I usually do that. It's one thing although I've varied my process and it changes from book to book, that's one thing I usually do. Whether I'm writing romance and I've got 2 opposite sort of archetypes, male and female, or whether I'm writing women's fiction and I might have 2 to 4 female point of views. The other good thing about this, especially if you are writing women's fiction, if you choose an archetype, obviously you make that archetype your own. But we talked about in our point of view episode a couple of weeks ago that differentiating between female characters, especially if they're the same age, kind of same background, it can be hard. So that's another way, like choosing an archetype can help you really make sure you've differentiated your characters enough. So I love that book, and it's hard to find now too, unfortunately.
Go on to eBay. It's amazing what you can find on eBay sometimes.
That's so true. Or Abe Books, which is a secondhand online, bookseller. That's where I just quickly looked up the thorn necklace that I'm going to order. I've also got a couple of books up there called 45 Master Characters and 20 Master Plots. The master plots I didn't find as useful because I looked at that recently when I was trying to brainstorm, as like something like Save the Cat. But the master archetypes I did find useful. And in that book of master archetypes, there's a list of questions, which I was thinking this reminded me a little bit, not that I remember all the questions you said about Francesca Leah Block, but these questions reminded me a little bit about that. And I thought these questions were really good. That is she introverted or extroverted? Does he solve problems using instincts, logical thinking, or emotion? Does she want to change the world? And it goes on, and there's about 12 questions, actually, a bit more than 12. Of really clear things, rather than like your character questionnaire that some people will do, like what's favorite color, food, all that kind of stuff. It's like, what do they consider to be fun? How do they feel about their sexuality? What are their hobbies? What do they think about men and marriage? Just really. So I found that was quite useful in coming up with my characters this time. I didn't answer all of them, but it made me think about some different things. Yeah. So again, that's a book that I have very much just dipped into.
Use it as a tool. I mean, I think that what I'm getting is that you use these books as tools, which is why you don't need to read them end to end, because you're going to them when you need something from them.
Yeah. Or if I'm feeling uncertain, and that's why I read Big Badger in a couple of months ago. I think like if I'm feeling that I need to polish up dialogue or am full of doubt, you know, I can choose a different book. Actually, one that's really good to dip in and out of is 10 Things About Writing by Joanne Harris, who wrote Chocolat all those years ago and many other books since. And this apparently it's a beautiful book too. So, you know, I do also like pretty things. It's a hardcover and it's just it's for those who are not watching but are listening, it's got shiny foil on the front and it's just pretty.
And I'm writing things down so I can put them in the show notes while every time you tell me a book, I'm noting.
I thought that's what you're doing. So this one, Joanne used to do a blog where she would write 10 things about something to do with writing. And then eventually she's put all those 10 things together. I don't know if the blog's still available, but this is a really handy way. So you can really dip in and out of that. And as I just said, like if you're feeling uncertain about something or you just need something to inspire you, like one of the parts here, there's 10 parts in this book. The first one's where do I start? The second is what makes a story. Then third is shall we dance? You like that chapter, Soph? Fourth is characterization, and it kind of goes on. So if I look into characterization, like it's got then things like it breaks that up into growing your characters, and then she's got 10 things about growing your characters. Main characters, you know, 10 things your main characters must have. Secondary and minor characters, 10 things. So it's really easy. You can just read one of those 10 things a day. You can dip out when you want. But I mean, she's a writer who knows her stuff. She's been doing it a long time and writes amazing books. So I really recommend that one. When you talked about structure before, another book that I have read more than most is Story Trumps Structure. And I think this as a pantser mostly, you know, it's always nice to sort of make people think you're doing it okay. Like, you know, you don't need to worry about plotting because story is more important than structure. So I got that book because of this, and I can't really remember much about it, but I do know it was very much worth reading. And when I did a workshop about Embrace Your Inner Pantser, I took stuff from this. So yeah, it's basically, it says all too often following the rules of writing can constrict rather than inspire you. And I guess that's kind of what we're saying, in that, you know, there are no rules. You've got to kind of know stuff, but don't think about it too much. It says with Stories Trump Structure, you can shed those rules about 3-act structure, rising action, outlining and more to craft your most powerful, emotional and gripping stories. So yeah, I can't remember much about it, but I think I want to dip into that one again because I really enjoyed it. And one thing that made me laugh is I think it was during lockdown, Marianne Keyes, who, if you don't know who Marianne Keyes is, well,
who even are you?
Where have you been? She has written, you know, for the last 20 or so years, a best-selling book every couple of years. And yeah, she's an amazing writer. And she did a little series during lockdown, 4 weeks it was, on Instagram, of how to write a book. And the really interesting thing was, she's like, until a couple of weeks ago, I didn't know what 3-act structure was, you know, and I think that just shows how, well, one thing with writing craft books or learning all this stuff is sometimes people do this instead of writing. You reckon? Like,
yeah, and also the interesting thing about 3-act structure is it does come to us from the movies. So
yeah.
So often with writing novels, particularly if you're writing long novels, as you and I both do, 3 acts isn't going to cut it. Like, it's just, and Into the Woods does address 5-act structures, more acts, but it's also that idea that does a novel, even contemporary or commercial fiction, need to follow that kind of strict structure? Because when we're talking about structure, I should also point out we're not necessarily talking about 3-act structure or 5.
No, and Marianne was saying she'd never heard of that. She didn't know what an inciting incident was. Like, no, you know, all this stuff that if you study writing craft, you will, certain words like catalyst, probably, just trying to think, inciting incident, midpoint, you know, in romance we call something the black moment. I've heard it all been called like the dark night of the soul. There's obviously, that could be the climax, you know, like you hear all these terms and she's like, I don't know any of them.
Yeah.
And it hasn't stopped her writing amazing books.
And sometimes they can get in the way. Sometimes really studying the craft can get in the way depending on your nature, because if you're really rule bound, then you can start to think, oh, I really need to follow that. And that can stop you writing the story in the way that makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, exactly. And also there's so much to learn out there, right? So you could just, I mean, if I read all these books, it would take me a year and a bit, like, so
You might confuse yourself on the way,
Yep, true. So, but there's a couple of, one series I do recommend, and this is not so much a how-to, but it's what would we say, like sort of a companion to writing. There's a whole series, I've got them behind here, and they're continually adding to them. It started with this one, the Emotion Thesaurus. And when you're like writing and you have to show, don't tell sometimes, and it's just like, all you can think about is, his heart was racing kind of thing, or, he was, the hairs in the back of the neck. So this book basically gives you all the emotions you might write, like relief, happiness, disillusionment, desperation, contempt. And then you go to the section. So here I've got opened at concern, and it gives you a definition of it. What you have, you don't really need that. I don't think I've ever looked at the definition here. But then it's got really important sections. So it's got physical signals and behaviours that you might see when a character is concerned. Things like opening one's mouth to speak, pausing to collect one's thoughts, then making a micro movement towards the object of concern, lowering or deepening one's voice. It goes a whole long list. Internal sensations you might feel of concerns. It's got pulse picking up, muscles tightening, and some of them are quite cliched, but often they'll make you think about other things. And there's a whole load of different ways to say, eyebrows rose, and then they've got mental responses. So examples like a hyper focus on one person or one thing, forgetting other priorities if you're concerned. So you can see what your characters, might be doing. That's some examples. And then they've got acute or long-term responses to this emotion, and that's following up, obsessive thoughts about the situation, crowdsourcing, one's mind going to worst case scenarios. So it gives you things, signs of emotions being suppressed. So it gives you lots and lots of things for each emotion. Now, again, occasionally I'll use this when writing because I'm like, oh, I really can't think of, this emotion. But most of the time it's sort of something that I might use in editing if I think, oh, I'm saying the same thing, over and over again. But the other emotions, or the other thesauruses so far, are the rural setting thesaurus, the urban thesaurus. Yep. And so there's some really great things in there. Like in the rural thesaurus, I just opened it to church. It says sights you might see in church, sounds you might see in church, smells you might see in church. So someone who's not good at description, that can help. But also possibly.
Where did you come across these books initially?
Initially, one of the writers, Angela Ackerman, came to the RWA conference, I think. But I think I may have heard of the emotional thesaurus before then. But it's also got, people found, in this place, possible sources of conflict in this place, and other. So, and then one of my favourite, they've got the negative trait thesaurus and the positive trait thesaurus. I don't go into detail on those because it's too much planning for me. But if you do like, really thinking about your character in those ways, they're ususeful.
And for anyone who's listening rather than watching us, Rach is going to her shelf to get these thesauruses.
Yes.
Because she has them to collect it, and there are like 7 or 8.
It's a big series, and they're doing another one at the moment. Oh, they're doing a secret thesaurus at the moment, which I'm very keen on. Because basically secrets are a big part of all fiction, and coming up with original secrets. Also, I'm really excited about that one. This one is the character emotional wound thesaurus. And I do often use this as well. I should have had that on my pile when I'm starting a book. If I might have an idea what has happened to the character in their past, like maybe they were adopted, like my new person, and it'll say that's finding out you're adopted is one of the emotional wounds.
So these are all available as ebook. I'm looking at them right now.
Yeah, they are ebook or print. I like having craft books in print so that I can sort of, although I do have a few on my Kindle, especially samples when I've like, no, you don't need to buy another one, but just download the sample and see. But
think about it for a while. Yeah.
The problem is the sample's never long enough, and then I'm like, oh, but maybe I do need it because anyway. So that's really good. All the emotional thesauruses are excellent. I've got 3 more books I just quickly want to mention before we wrap up, even though I could, as you can clearly see, talk about this forever. I really liked Writing into the Dark by Dean Wesley Smith, because again, if you're someone who doesn't necessarily have a good idea of your book, I think another one of the myths about pantsing is that you just literally sit down and start writing with no idea, and that is probably a very, very bad idea. I think to be well, again, there's no absolutes and no rules, but to be a complete pantser, you are probably gonna I don't want to say waste time, Sophie, because but you might go down lots of places and, you're really going to be having to work it all out as you go. So just having some key thoughts about your characters, and what the whole point of the book is, what you want to explore, all that sort of stuff can be useful. But a good way of looking at that, if you don't want a big kind of outline and I'm not that person that can really think that far ahead, is that book, Riding into the Dark. And another book I really loved was The Pocket Guide to Pantsing.
Oh, that is gold.
Isn't it? It's so good. And there was lots of really useful, tips in here. As I said, I've done a workshop myself on embracing your inner pantser, and it's all about, following your gut and trusting the magic. But there are some things you can do to make that process easier, even if you don't write an outline. So those books are good. Now, this last one I want to talk about is called The Bestseller Code. Have you heard of this one?
I think only because you might have bought it when we were around the time we started the podcast, or maybe.
Oh, no, I've had this for a while, but I may have mentioned it then. I may have mentioned it before because I haven't read the whole thing, but I have dipped in and out of this, and I think that's a good thing, as you would know about nonfiction books, being a nonfiction publisher. The good thing is you don't necessarily have to read them from cover to cover. So this book I bought because it is about, two people who are more scientists, if I remember rightly, wanted to kind of analyze books that were bestsellers. So they did things like the Da Vinci Code, 50 Shades of Grey, if I remember rightly, Harry Potter, a lot of Nora Roberts books they put in there, Nicholas Sparks, Stephen King, people whose books are consistently bestsellers. Right. And they kind of wanted to analyze what they had in common, even if they were, like Stephen King, say, and W. Bruce Cameron's A Dog's Purpose books, quite different, probably, E.L. James and, some of these books are very different. The E.L. James saying the Da Vinci Code, probably quite different, 50 Shades of Grey. But
are they?
Yeah, well, exactly. And they put all the things in here. They made a system with algorithms and all this, and they feed the books into it and sort of pulled out the commonalities between them all. And titles was one thing that really seemed to affect bestsellers, which I found really interesting. So I remember I have started thinking more about titles since reading that book. I mean, I always knew they're important, but I probably used to put more weight in cover than title. And not just because, obviously you want a title that's memorable so people can go to the bookshop and say, hey, have you got this book? But they go into literally detail of how many words in a title is better and what words, keywords that, come out. There's some really interesting things. And I think if I remember, there was the universal themes that are in all these books and, why they're relatable no matter kind of what your life experience is. So although that's not a craft book, it's an interesting book to think about, what you can do that's, obviously you don't want to copy any of these books, but just to think about how you can use your idea already and sort of enhance it with these sort of points. So I really recommend it. It's just really interesting to read the analysis of why certain books seem to have done well and, others not so much. That's a very brief introduction to my love affair with writing craft books.
Brief introduction, but a really great, useful, detailed session, I think. I hope that everyone who's listening and or watching has found that as interesting as I did. And yes, I have been noting down to just the titles that you like as opposed to ones that you weren't necessarily sure about, and we'll put them in the show notes for people to look them up. A lot of them are, I think, available as ebook, which is handy if you don't want to add to your shelves.
If you're not like me and don't need them in print.
And also have to say thank you, Rachel, for doing the research on behalf of the listenership, because you've done a lot of the work for us. You've actually read these books so you can tell us which
some of them. I mean, there's many more here that I'm very excited about reading, which I think, would be great. For example, one is Creativity Inc., which is all about Pixar. And, why, there's so many great books out that, I could, do one a month, I think, and really maybe write about them. Maybe that's what I should do. Just add that to my never-ending list.
Well, we could look, listeners, watchers, if you think that we should do a craft book club,
I think it's a great idea.
let us know, because then it could actually be interactive with listening. So yeah, there you go. There's an idea. Craft book club. Writing craft book club.
I love that.
I think it's a good idea. Rach and I might just go ahead and do it anyway, because
and also like some of the ones that, you know, by bird, which are, you know, like things like that. But also, please, listeners, if you have any craft books that you absolutely love, like, can you send us a recommendation? Tell us why you like it, and if you don't mind us, we'll read them out maybe on a future podcast.
Yeah, because we're all about sharing the information and hoping that it's helpful.
And you know, I always need to add to my although the problem is now, because I've ripped a whole load out, so it looks like there's spaces, but there's not really spaces. And so I would have to rearrange my whole bookshelf.
Yeah, I have shelves like that for yoga books. So that's what my particular library is for reference books, is a whole lot of yoga books from many, many years past.
Wow. Yes. No, that's really, I can relate. And that reminds me, I really feel like it, you know, it'd be interesting, I say, as yoga and writing, like, what has changed in the yoga world? Like, I'm guessing things have, but I'm guessing there's some core principles and stuff that, you know, despite everything else that's going in the world, they've stayed the same.
Yeah, I would. Yes, I won't go into it in detail because we should wrap up the episode. But yeah, yoga's been around for 7,000 years. So yes, there are absolutely core principles that are the same, and one of them is the function of the practice, which is to prepare the body to sit in meditation.
Yeah.
Period of time. So that everything, well, the river flows towards that point, shall we say?
And I think I was just going to say that's the same, I'm guessing, like this craft book bestseller that I've had forever, and some of those earlier ones that I've mentioned. Like this one was written in 1996. So it would be really interesting to see, you know, there's a lot of things in that time that have changed in the industry, but
absolutely,
has story changed?
Has story changed, I think, is a fascinating question to consider, because I think John Yorke would argue in Into the Woods that, in fact, I think has made the argument that it does not, that actually the fundamental principles of storytelling, the structure that humans respond to, have been the same for millennia, arguably.
That's what I would think too. Anyway, it's only been 2 days actually since we recorded our last podcast, so I won't ask you what you're reading unless you've got anything else to add. I'm still reading the book that I started, because I started literally the day that we had our last podcast. I'm loving it though. That's The Wedding People, and I highly recommend it.
Excellent. Well, Rach, maybe the next time we talk, I will have a different book to tell you about, and you may have a different book to tell me about.
I'm sure we will.
Now we will leave it, and our listeners / watchers can go to the list of books that are in the show notes if they want.
Thanks for listening to me ramble on about craft books.
You're not rambling at all. It was fascinating. Rach, I'll see you next time.
Bye.